Hi everyone, I guess we'll get started. We wanted to welcome you to the SEEC webinar about energy program funding for local governments. My name is Jenny Woods and I'm a project coordinator at the Local Government Commission, and I want to provide a quick overview of the webinar and go over some logistics before I turn it over to our speakers today. Local governments currently face a lot of uncertainty as sources that many depend on to fund their energy programs are set to expire. The long-term programs that are needed to meet state climate change and energy goals are difficult to accomplish under these circumstances. This webinar will provide updates from the California Public Utilities Commission and the investor-owned utilities on the status of energy efficiency programs. We will also highlight San Jose, a community that has set up an energy fund to support energy efficiency and renewable energy projects at municipal facilities. Just to give you some background information, this is the 9th of 15 webinars we will be hosting over the next 3 years through the Statewide Energy Efficiency Collaborative. SEEC is a collaborative between the Local Government Commission, ICLEI, the Institute for Local Governments, and California's 4 investor-owned utilities. The partnership was established in the 2009 CPUC decision and was intended to help communities reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save energy. I want to go over a few logistics before we get started. Due to the large number of participants, everyone will be muted during the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions during the webinar, we ask that you type your comment in the question box, which is on your right hand of the screen. Please include the name of the speaker that your question is intended for. Atisha from LGC will be summarizing these questions during the question and answer period following each speaker. We will also have a question and answer period for any remaining questions at the very end of the webinar. Any of the questions we don't get to, we'll ask the presenters to respond to after the webinar, and we will make them available on our website. If you have any IT questions, you can also write in the question box and write IT at the beginning of your message. The presentations from the webinar will be available on lgc.org/seek/webinars. We will also provide a recording of the webinar on that same site once that is available. When the webinar concludes, you will be asked to complete a survey. We ask that you take 5 minutes to provide us with your feedback, which helps us improve our future webinars. It helps us choose future webinar topics, and it makes sure that these webinars are as useful for you as possible. We have a great list of speakers, starting with Andy Schwartz. Andy Schwartz is supervisor of the CPUC's Emerging Procurement Strategies team. This group focuses on issues related to cap-and-trade implementation, electric vehicle market development, as well as issues and programs supporting combined heat power. He joined the Commission in 2005 and holds a Master's in Public Policy from UC Berkeley's Goldman School. I'm going to turn the webinar over to Andy so he can provide in his section of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, Jenny, this is Andy Schwartz. Thanks so much, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak at today's webinar. As indicated in the agenda, my presentation is going to be providing an overview of the cap-and-trade program, and then discuss a little bit more, or dive into a little bit more detail on the activities of the CPUC, specifically related to some of the issues that I think are pertinent to the audience today, which is the availability and use of the allowance revenues that are going to be generated from the sale of the emission allowances that are allocated to the utilities. First, by way of background, the cap-and-trade program was established in AB 32, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It established a goal of reducing statewide emissions of greenhouse gases to 1990 levels by 2020, and then a very aggressive goal of 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. In December of 2008, the ARB came out with their scoping plan, which kind of identified the key set of programmatic efforts and frameworks that would be used to achieve those emission reductions. First identified on this slide is cap and trade, which, as you all know, is a sort of market-based approach to reducing emissions by setting a total cap and then issuing allowances up to that cap. And then it identified a series of complementary measures that would be used to support those emission reductions. In a very real sense, the cap and trade program is sort of a backstop to these complementary measures, which are things like the RPS program, the renewables portfolio standard, the low carbon fuel standard, et cetera, with those measures accounting for really the lion's share of emission reductions anticipated under the program. Cap and trade is anticipated to really capture about 20 to 25% of the emission reductions required to hit the 2020 target, with again most of the emission reductions being achieved through those complementary programs. Moving to slide 3. The cap and trade program itself establishes an annual emissions cap across sectors with compliance beginning in 2013. Initially, the cap is going to cover the large stationary sources. An important factor in the approach that's being used in California is that the cap is going to be, or the regulated entities are going to be the sources, so those that are actually emitting greenhouse gases. So in-state, that's power plants, large industrial facilities, et cetera. The one exception is that we do have a substantial amount of power imports. For the imported energy, the point of regulation is the entity that's first bringing that energy across the border. One of the important features, and what I'll get into in more detail later in my presentation, is the allocation of allowances. They're going to be directly given to some of the covered entities. So the two sort of sets of entities that I think are most important for today's conversation are the allowances that are going to the electric distribution utilities, where they're getting a direct allocation based on their expected emissions. And then the other direct allocation is going to these entities that are deemed trade exposed and emissions intensive for reasons that I'll get into in a moment. Following the initial period, in 2015, the framework is going to expand to include transportation fuels as well as gas suppliers. Moving to slide 4, one of the key issues and one of the key concerns of the program is, of course, the cost of imposing a limit on carbon emissions and really creating a program where there's not going to be a cost on carbon where previously there wasn't one. The issue of cost is really important because it's one of the factors that motivated the ARB to decide to allocate some of the allowances for free to different compliance entities. So as described here, who ultimately bears the cost under cap and trade really depends on the ability of a given entity regulated under the program to either avoid carbon cost exposure or their ability to pass any carbon costs upstream, for example, to suppliers, or downstream to customers. Some commercial entities may be able to reduce their carbon cost exposure through process changes, investments in energy efficiency. Others may be able to pass those costs through to customers in the form of higher prices. But there are other instances where the ability of an entity to sort of pass their costs on or reduce their emissions is somewhat constrained. In particular, the ARB has expressed a lot of concern that there are entities that are significantly trade exposed that do not have the ability to pass those higher carbon, the cost of carbon onto their customers. Doing so would basically just mean that those customers would migrate to other suppliers who are not covered by the carbon regime, for example, out-of-state suppliers, and really just lead to a migration of the industrial activity to outside of the state. This is sort of generally known as emissions leakage. To address that, as I'll get into in a moment, ARB is directly allocating allowances to some of those entities. The last group that I would say that sort of obviously may have difficulty in either avoiding their carbon cost exposure or passing costs on is households. Basically, at the end of the day, to the extent the cap and trade regime results in somewhat higher energy prices or costs for commodities or products that have some embedded emissions, households will ultimately bear those costs. To address the cost issue, the cap and trade program has a number of features which are intended to mitigate costs. First, the cap and trade program itself is as a policy mechanism intended to, limit the extent to which meeting or minimize the costs of achieving the emission reduction goals. Basically, by issuing permits that can be traded, the idea is that entities will have have kind of an option to determine whether or not it's cheaper for them to reduce their emissions or buy a permit, and then they can also, and in addition, they can trade and purchase permits, and in so doing, they can sort of reduce the cost overall of reducing emissions consistent with the cap will be minimized. The other element of the program, or another element, is the use of offsets. So offsets are projects that reduce emissions in areas or sectors that are not already covered by the cap. ARB allows entities to use or to meet their annual compliance obligation for up to use offsets for up to 8% of their annual compliance obligation using offsets. Another sort of cost mitigation tool is the ability to bank. So entities may use there's a typo in this slide, I apologize, but entities may bank a given year's allowances and apply them to future years. ARB has also established a cost containment reserve mechanism. So they've set aside a portion of allowances that if prices should rise to a certain level, will in effect act as a pressure valve, and they'll begin selling those once that threshold price is reached. And then two areas that I think are of particular interest for the conversation today. There's the direct allocation of emission allowances, particularly those to the electric distribution utilities, which I mentioned earlier. The electric distribution utilities are going to receive a direct allocation of allowances. They're going to be required to consign these allowances to auction with the proceeds of those sales flowing back to the utilities. And one of the issues that we're grappling with right now here at the Commission is how should those monies be used for the benefit of ratepayers. And then lastly, I've mentioned the Air Pollution Control Fund. So the auction of the proceeds from the auction of allowances that are not directly allocated to the electric distribution utilities will go into the Air Pollution Control Fund. And these are monies that can be used for purposes designated in the Health and Safety Code upon appropriation by the legislature. Moving to slide 6. I wanted to talk about now, turn to sort of what is the Commission doing on these issues, specifically on the use of allowance revenues. So the CPUC has opened an OIR, an order instituting a rulemaking, in March that is specifically scoped to address the issue of how the revenues from the sale of allowances allocated to the distribution utilities would be used. It's divided into 3 tracks. Track 1 is addressing the use of the revenues generated from the sale of emission allowances, with the current schedule calling for a decision in June of next year. Track 2 will be looking at how we might use revenues generated from the sale of low-carbon fuel standard credits. This is another program, complementary program to AB 32. Under which the utilities may be allocated some amount of credits associated with electricity that's used as a transportation fuel. The current schedule calls for a decision in October of next year on that. And then Track 3 is really, at this point, is sort of tentatively scoped out to address Gas Utility Procurement Authority as it relates to greenhouse gas compliance products and the use of revenues, to the extent there is a direct allocation to the gas utilities. In terms of the value of the allowances that we are looking at, the numbers, obviously, the value really depends on sort of what price we see in the market when the allowances that are allocated to the utilities are sold in auction. If you look at the floor price that has been set for these auctions, in aggregate, the value between 2013 and 2020 of the allowances is around $6 billion. If you look at the price threshold at which point the containment reserve allowances would be sold, you're talking about a much higher amount of revenues on the order of $24 billion. So it's a very significant pool of capital. A key issue for us is interpreting the language that says that these funds will be used for the benefit of ratepayers, essentially to compensate them for the cost they experience under the cap-and-trade program. To that end, from a staff standpoint, when the ruling came out establishing the OIR and the scope of that OIR, staff came out with a series of potential policy outcomes and considerations that we are going to be using, among others that might be proposed by parties, to evaluate various potential proposals on the use of those allowance revenues. So I'll just run through these very quickly. Slide 8. The first issue is this notion of preserving the carbon price signal. One of the way in which cap-and-trade works is by internalizing the cost of carbon, and in so doing, exposing customers to the opportunity cost of their energy consumption. And so there is some concern that if you use the revenues to in some way blunt that price signal, you'll be working at cross purposes to the intent of the regime. Another factor that we are looking at, or another policy consideration, is this issue of economic leakage, which I mentioned before. The issue being that entities that are trade exposed cannot really pass the costs on to end customers, and face competition from those that aren't subject to the regime. So we want to do everything we can to avoid that, because basically allowing that to happen would be lose-lose for California. Total emissions wouldn't be reduced, and we'd simply lose the economic activity associated with those emissions. The third issue, or policy consideration, is this notion of equitably distributing the revenue value, recognizing the atmosphere as a public asset, to the degree that the cap-and-trade program is essentially leasing access to the atmosphere as a dumping ground for carbon emissions. It seems there is an equity consideration of the atmosphere as a public commons, and the proceeds from its use should go to everybody. Another factor is reducing or mitigating the adverse impacts on low-income households. I think that one speaks for itself. The next factor that I'd highlight is the potential using the revenues to correct for market failures that lead to underinvestment in greenhouse gas mitigation activities and technologies. So the idea here is that perhaps one potential use would be to support additional investments in research and development around clean energy technologies like energy efficiency and renewables. Another factor that we think is important is ensuring that whatever is done with the revenues, we don't adversely or unintentionally disadvantage certain competitors in the marketplace. So whatever approach is used to the revenues, it should be competitively neutral across load-serving entities. And then lastly, I think an important factor is that whatever we do should be administratively simple and relatively easy to understand. Moving to slide 9, I wanted to talk about who is participating in our proceeding. We do have 47 listed active parties. They represent a very diverse set of stakeholders, including the utilities, the independent generators, environmental groups, low-income advocacy organizations, more broad consumer advocacy organizations, community choice aggregators, energy service providers, industrial interests, as well as there is some representation from local governments in that proceeding. Currently in the proceeding, in terms of what parties have done thus far, they have submitted initial proposals on the use of allowance revenues, and through those proposals, I think we've identified what some of the key issues are as we move forward. That there seems to be some coalescing around these items. First is addressing the indirect emissions cost exposure for these emission-intensive trade-exposed entities. A number of parties have raised concerns and proposals related to address that. There are basic allocational questions. So what is the basic sort of approach we use if we are going to distribute revenues either directly to customers or to other entities? Do we want to provide it on the basis of who bears the cost under the program? Would we want to do it on the basis of kind of more of that public commons notion as sort of a lump sum payment? Similarly, would we, if we are going to do it on some sort of cost basis, would it be done volumetrically? So, for every unit of energy you use, would you get some amount of the revenues to compensate you for the additional cost there? And then a number of parties have suggested sort of these additional uses of the revenues. So a number of parties have suggested using at least some of the funds to support additional investments in renewables, energy efficiency, as well as R&D. Other groups have suggested the notion of a community benefits fund. So basically the idea being to use those monies to support capacity building, to address the impacts of climate change itself, as well as to address the cost impacts of the cap-and-trade program. And then lastly, an issue that's been raised by a number of parties is ensuring that whatever we do, we maintain appropriate incentives for combined heat and power. Moving to slide 10, here, so obviously a key area for local governments to get involved is in the CPUC proceeding related to the use of allowance revenues. But there are a couple additional areas that I can't claim to be an expert on, but that I think probably make sense for local governments to engage in. So the first is with regard to the Air Pollution Control Fund. As I mentioned earlier, the revenues associated with the auctioning of allowances that haven't been directly allocated to the electric distribution utilities will be flowing into the Air Pollution Control Fund. As I understand it, those monies can be used pursuant to certain sections of the Public Health and Safety Code, once they've been appropriated by the legislature. My understanding is that the Air Resources Board is going to be making recommendations on the potential use of those monies. So, the ARB represents, a critical forum for local governments to engage with to the extent they feel that some of those funds should be used to support their interests and activities. And then I would also mention the De Leon bill, Senate Bill 535, which would create a community benefits fund. It's the under the terms of the bill, they would create the California Healthy Air Revitalization Trust, into which would flow a minimum of 10% of the allowance auction revenues from the Air Pollution Control Fund. And these monies would be used to fund programs in the state's most disadvantaged and impacted communities to address the health and environmental impacts associated with climate change. That pretty much concludes my presentation. My contact information is on the next slide, on slide 11, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy, for that very detailed and informative presentation. I don't see any questions coming in yet. If anyone has any, I encourage you to go ahead and type that into your questions feature on the right-hand side of your screen. Also, we'll be doing some questions at the very end, so if you're just digesting information and can think of things throughout presentations, please feel free to do that.
Okay, well, great. Thanks, Atisha, and thank you, Andy, for that really informative presentation. Up next, we're going to have Frank Spasaro, and he is going to be talking about the public goods charge. And Frank Spasaro is currently responsible for managing the local government and institutional energy efficiency partnerships for Southern California Gas Company. He is also responsible for developing and implementing their on-bill financing program and energy efficiency engineering group. Since joining Southern California Gas Company in 1983, he has spent the majority of his career working on energy efficiency, including several policy and oversight positions. He has been responsible for the development of many marketing programs to promote energy efficiency, and he has managed the gas company's Energy Resource Center. So now I'm going to turn it over to Frank.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I've actually got 3 topics to cover. If you could move to slide 2, please. I only have 2 slides, so I'll just keep the one up. The 3 topics that I wanted to cover was the current status of the natural gas public purpose program surcharge, the status of the electric public goods charge, and then discuss a little bit about the recent ruling from Commissioner Farron about the bridge cycle extension for the current cycle and his ruling that he just issued on that. So on the public purpose gas surcharge program, as most of you I'm sure were aware, under the current state budget cycle, the legislature didn't borrow, I'm not sure which is the right word to describe it, but up to $155 million of the current PPP charge. That's about 1/3 the amount of our current authorized energy efficiency budget. Theoretically, the low-income programs are also covered under that same charge, but it pretty much represents 1/3 of the energy efficiency budget. Fortunately, the good news is that the PUC authorized the gas utilities to use some prior year underspending from prior cycles to backfill the current gap that the $155 million would have created in our budget. So that pretty much gets all the gas utilities through the end of next year, which would close out the current authorized cycle. So it kind of gets us back on track. So that's the good news. The second big good news is that when this all transpired, the Natural Resources Defense Council actually filed a lawsuit, and I believe it was October 19th or 20th. Superior Court actually ruled in favor of their lawsuit, which in essence tells the state that they can't take that money. Unfortunately, the state has the ability to appeal that decision, and I think they have until around December 20th to file that appeal. We haven't heard that they're going to do it or not going to do it, but it's a pretty simple process to to file that appeal and would basically unstay the stay and would allow them to take the money, which, by the way, as far as anybody is aware, they have actually not taken any money prior to the Superior Court ruling. So the money was still there and had not been taken from the accounts yet, but sort of depends on what happens with the appeal. If the state doesn't file the appeal, then that's amazingly great news. That would pretty much put behind us this whole issue about what would happen, because then there's no other recourse for the state. If they do file the appeal, then it unfortunately sort of leaves open what could happen in the future. While we certainly are, as I said, okay through 2012, it would allow the legislature in the next budget cycle to potentially look at additional taking of funds. It could be more, it could be less, under the current state of the economy. And I think the key issue was what was going to be happening with tax revenues, and as far as I know, that's not looking great, so the concern is still there. There's also the possibility that the legislature could take up the issue of fixing in legislation the item that allows the state to actually have access to the funds under the Board of Equalization area. And unfortunately, that didn't get approved this last legislative session, but could be taken up again in the one starting up in January, and it could be fixed. So there is also that opportunity. Under the electric public goods surcharge, as part of the same legislative session, the legislature did not reauthorize extending the electric PGC, which expires at the end of this year. But fortunately, things work differently on the electric side than they do with the gas side, so the PUC has the ability to fix the problem, and in essence they did by just allowing the electric utilities to move what was called PGC collection on the utility bill over to the procurement collection, which is where we were collecting the additional amounts of, I want to say it was 200 and I forget exactly, 200 some odd $million that was in the PGC per year, but we were spending significantly more than that on energy efficiency by adding additional charges under the procurement mechanism, and basically we're just going to collect all of it under procurement. That would cover only energy efficiency and would again take us through the end of this cycle, through the end of next year. It does not cover RD&D, which was also funded under the electric PGC. The Commission is undertaking a separate proceeding, I think, to address what should be done with RD&D. But to fix the energy efficiency issues, they did authorize the utilities to collect all of the funds under procurement. Again, this will only take us through 2012, so sort of bridging into the next item, and pardon the pun, but it would not cover the bridge year yet, and it certainly doesn't cover the next cycle. So the PUC would have to take that up as well, and whatever the plans are there. While in parallel, the legislature again could be taking this up, and the rumor is that there's a lot of interest to take it up again in January. So it is very possible that the PGC could be re-established and there could be a new charge, and based on what was discussed in this last legislative session, it could cover additional items than what we're currently doing with the electric energy efficiency funds and RD&D funds at the moment. So good news and some stay tuned news on that one. And then under the final item I wanted to just touch on real quickly is Commissioner Farron issued a ruling just a little bit ago. Parties have filed opening and reply comments on it. But basically it's a two-part ruling, one to cover extending the current 3-year cycle as proposed another 2 years. He's calling it a bridge. That has certain implications as to what would be done versus just simply extending the cycle. He's proposing that a number of things be done. All things that were, or mostly things that were discussed at the legislative session where the governor had actually challenged the PUC to kind of try to take up some of these things. So there's a little bit of that in this. And it also covers what we would be doing in parallel to start getting ready for the next cycle. So some of the planning that would need to get done. But key areas. One, it's a 2-year bridge, not a 1-year bridge. As far as comments that were filed by parties, I didn't see anybody that really substantively challenged that it should be 2 years. Shouldn't be 2 years, that is, so it would very likely be a 2-year deal. He wanted to focus a lot on financing to pursue deeper retrofits, primarily in commercial and residential facilities. There were a number of comments filed on that. A lot of folks had some pretty interesting ideas, certainly a lot of support for doing more with financing. So I'm pretty confident that we're going to see some new approaches to additional financing options for the energy efficiency market, so that's going to be a very positive tool to add. He also, in the ruling, discussed expanding local government and third-party programs. There were several ideas there. I think the key notion was that most folks want to make sure that it's a very simple extension going into with the current contracts that we have with local government partnerships. So that sort of by definition minimizes how many changes we're going to be able to implement during the 2-year time frame if we're going to ensure we do have contracts by January 1 to ensure a smooth transition for the bridge. But there were definitely proposals that were presented in the comments that could be of interest, and interesting to see exactly how we fold that in with the notion of trying to ensure a smooth transition contractually. I was very encouraged to see that he brought up the water energy nexus and asked folks for comments about things that we could try to be doing with the water energy nexus issue, which had been floundering for quite a while, unfortunately. So it's really good to see that that would be addressed. Hopefully the PUC will give us some of the tools, primarily give us the data we can use for our cost effectiveness, so we can actually try to figure out ways to cover some of the what appear to be pretty obvious things that we can be doing to save water and save energy at the same time. He also proposes eliminating the bulk of the CFL activity and some of what we do with appliance recycling. Most parties agree that something needs to be done. I think there are going to be some challenges with the cost effectiveness of the portfolio that are going to need to be addressed, and I believe some folks raised that in their comments, so we'll have to see exactly how that rolls out. And then there's a bunch of procedural things in terms of how we do the planning and getting the goals and the ex-ante assumptions and some of those other things that just are part of the necessary process that were also discussed. The key thing here is that the utilities are, at least under the current schedule, would be filing our program plans for the bridge at the end of April. That's not much time between now and that time frame, so it'd be interesting to see what his draft and final decision says, which I believe the draft is due end of December and the final would be end of January. That doesn't give us a lot of time to turn around a lot of major changes to the portfolios, but that's basically potentially what we would be on the hook to be doing. And then again, as I noted, in the ruling there's a full schedule laid out. I didn't present it here, but he also talks about all of the things that we would need to be doing for the next planning cycle, things like addressing cost effectiveness and such that folks all pretty much agree needs to be addressed in sort of a new paradigm of how we do energy efficiency. And that pretty much covers everything that I had, so any questions?
Thank you, Frank, for your very insightful presentation. Does anyone have any questions for Frank? Okay, if not, again, I just want to encourage everyone to use that questions feature throughout presentations, and we can come back to questions for Frank at the end as well.
Okay, thank you, Frank. That was a really great presentation. Next, we're going to move on to Mary Tucker, and she's going to discuss the San Jose Revolving Energy Fund. Mary Tucker is the Energy Program Manager for the City of San Jose. She is currently responsible for coordination of the city's energy activities, including municipal and community energy efficiency and renewable energy installation programs, energy demand reduction activities, and energy policy and advocacy activities. So I am going to turn it over to Mary for her presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be part of this webinar for everyone. We can move to the next slide, please. The City of San Jose's Energy Fund policy started with the very initial policy about 4 years ago, with all of the rebates that we achieved as a result of energy efficiency projects returning to this fund to be able to initiate more energy efficiency projects. But what we learned very quickly was that there was really a need to have a dedicated staff person that would not only identify energy projects, but to go out there and implement them. And we were our public works / general services person who had been originally assigned to the city for energy activities was being more and more drawn into other capital projects, and so was not being able to dedicate their time to looking for more projects. So then the city received a $300,000 rebate when we installed LED traffic signals throughout the city. This was one of the initiatives of our Department of Transportation. And so what we did was basically latch on to that right away. We had been talking about the need for a dedicated staff person. And so what we had proposed to our city manager's office and budget and everyone was, let us, really have a dedicated energy officer focusing on the municipal facilities for 2 years to be able to work with the utilities, to get the audits, and to work with some of the other local government partnerships to really facilitate the implementation of these projects. The money would have gone back into our general fund, and used for a variety of other activities throughout the city. So we were able to get the money for that dedicated energy officer position, and $100,000 of that went to the Department of Transportation for additional LED projects, street lights and other street traffic signals. We were given an initial allocation of the time of about $60,000 for energy efficiency projects. Not very much at the beginning. This came from a variety of different funds and projects. Next slide, please. So what we wanted to really show was that the city had adopted various policies on reducing the energy costs throughout the city, getting those permanent savings with energy efficiency and renewables, being able to accumulate enough money to really jumpstart the energy efficiency work, and definitely have some additional funds for the implementation of future energy projects. So in the beginning, we were not given that kind of jumpstart, money to be able to get things going, but we were doing as much as we can with the monies that we had and identifying things. We had presented the ideas of using energy service companies to the city, but the decision makers were hesitant to be able to enter into those kinds of loan agreements. So next slide, please. As I said, for the revolving fund, the city's energy fund, which is basically like a revolving energy fund, and I'm sorry for those A's there. They're supposed to be something else that didn't come through. They're supposed to be arrows showing that it revolves there. So we did have utility rebates at first. We were able to update the policy for the City Energy Fund so that first and second year savings from our installed projects, energy efficiency and solar projects, would be returned to this fund. And we had tried to get longer than first and second year savings, but we're not able to get those decisions made. Many cities have dedicated all of their energy savings goes back, and they also have charges to other city departments, but we were only able at the time to get first and second year savings. With the influx of the stimulus funds, the energy efficiency and conservation block grant funds, that really gave the huge boost to our municipal energy efficiency work. The city overall received by formula $8.8 million, and more than half of that went into improvements for our municipal facilities. parks, community centers, libraries, and a variety of other facilities that we had prioritized. So that has really given us the influx of funds that we are able to use to continue to fund the energy officer position and to do many more projects. This is only for our city's general fund projects. Other special funds and restricted funds such as the airport, the convention center, and our treatment plant that have designated funds, all of their rebates and savings go back to those funds. So this only approaches general funds. Next slide, please. As I said, the use of the funds, we have one full-time city energy officer. Her funding right now is only coming for those savings, so she's definitely dedicated to trying getting as much savings and projects as can. We are focusing on our general funded facilities first and foremost. We've prioritized, we have the projects. We work with an interdepartmental energy team comprised of the energy officer and our environmental services department, but also the public works department responsible for operation and maintenance, and all of our client departments, parks, libraries, police, community centers. So they are all involved in this and have a say on the priority in where we put our energy efficiency. Our second priority has definitely been on renewables. We have been able to secure several power purchase agreements with entities. In September of this year, we signed a power purchase agreement with Solar City. That was after we conducted a request for proposals for up to 4 megawatts of solar on up to 28 different city facilities. That agreement was approved by our City Council in September, and so we are moving forward with that installation. We had estimated that for those facilities, assuming everything goes well with all of them, there was the potential for a $5 million payback or return on those projects, and savings could be achieved within the first year. We've definitely been focusing on the fastest payback of our projects and looking at that. For those projects and departments that are not supported by general fund, we do provide some technical support in referring them to resources for energy efficiency. Next slide, please. So the results for this, definitely having a sustainable source of funding for reinvestment in municipal energy projects. I'll talk in the next slide about some of the issues associated with that. We definitely have ongoing energy reductions in our municipal facilities. It's been a value added for city departments in the improvements that we've made to those facilities. We've saved, since 2007, $235,000 in cost savings and energy rebates of a little bit over $500,000. Next slide, please. What have we learned from all of this? Definitely there is a need to have a clear understanding of the process, and that led us to the development of standard operating procedures on how the money is taken. Definitely having to inform the departments and make sure that they are well aware of this policy, that because you have savings in your utility bills, those savings, first and foremost are going back into the energy fund for other projects, and then the ongoing savings revert to the overall general fund. The allocation of funds is based on an estimated energy cost savings, and so we are definitely watching what's happening as a result of our projects to make sure that we are achieving the energy fund, the energy savings that we had estimated associated with this. And so having a clear tracking system, energy management system to understand to make sure that things are working as they should be is important. We definitely understand that there are diminishing returns over time, that if you don't keep providing any additional funds over and above what you've got in there, that you're going to definitely have diminished returns. Our energy officer, Julie Benavente, has done an initial analysis that shows that without an additional burst of funds to the project, the Energy Fund will definitely run out by 2016 or 2017. And so we are looking to see where there are other opportunities and other ways to do the energy efficiency work that's needed within the city. There's also the potential allocation of those funds to meet other general fund deficits. You heard in the last presentation from Frank about how the state took some of the natural gas funds that were allocated for energy efficiency. Well, that can happen on the local level too. These funds for this fiscal year, starting in July of this year, fiscal year 2011-12, within the mayor's budget message and the council's subsequent adoption of the budget, they took $100,000 of the city's energy fund to meet other deficits, to support other general fund needs, basically keeping the libraries and the parks open. So that's a risk that we ran. We're trying to hope that that doesn't happen again, but that's something that could happen unless you may have clear policies or a way to keep the money from, going over to other issues. But that's a council decision. Then there's also the impact of facility closures, service level reductions, what happens when you have, and this is definitely something that the City of San Jose is facing right now. We've made some improvements on city facilities, and it looks like several of the facilities are either going to close or definitely reduce their hours and have reduced service level reductions. In some ways, that looks really great for energy efficiency. It looks like you're saving a whole lot more, but it's not as a result of the work that you've done. But if we've installed solar on that facility, it's looking at, the ability to save over that. So those are some of the, excuse me, issues that we have learned, lessons that we have learned that we are addressing right now. And that we would give as advice to anyone else who was thinking to set something up like this. Like many other cities who are facing the loss of their stimulus funds, we are looking at other options for continuing to do our municipal facilities, to be able to use some of the public goods charge money, the on-bill financing programs, looking at other loan possibilities and where that comes from, California Energy Commission financing, or possibly the performance contracts. So we are researching and doing a lot of work in looking at these funds. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Very useful information there. We had one question come in for you about your presentation. The question is, are projects selected only on payback and renewables, or are there carbon or electricity reduction goals that have to be met for each project or the entire portfolio?
There are no carbon goals per se that are that's a criteria for the selection of our projects. We try to understand, both capital needs that may be associated with HVAC improvements. If the life of a HVAC system is coming, to its end, definitely that weighs into it. We look at, the use of the facility and all of that. We look at the energy savings, hoping to have a return on investment with at least a 3 to 5 year return on our investment. Those are our priorities. But, and getting the best energy savings that we can.
Okay, great. Were there any other questions for Mary? If not, a few questions came in for Frank, and we can go back to those. One question, Frank, was about the last piece of your presentation. The question was, why eliminate CFL appliance recycling?
Okay, there we go. Okay, so there are two separate items, but the CFLs, I think the feeling is that after all the years of support that market is transformed. It's debatable as to what level it's been transformed, but that's pretty much the premise that the commissioner was requesting feedback on. Is that really the case or not? And I think for the most part, people are feeling that in a lot of places it is. How much or not, I think, is a challenge. The question on appliance recycling, I think, was focused primarily on refrigerators, and I think, again, there was the thought that most people are already doing that through the big box stores when they buy the refrigerators, that's already kind of happening, so maybe we don't need to be subsidizing it through the energy efficiency programs anymore. Again, I think there are some challenges to whether or not that's truly the case or not, but that was what he was asking questions about to see if that, in fact, is the case and should be done.
Okay, great. And then we had a second question for you, Frank. Does the IER, or is the program coming to an end?
Good question. The short answer is no. PEER would be the RD&D program, and it's sort of separately treated under the electric PGC funding. And I think there were some issues about exactly how it could be moved forward if the PUC were to be funding it. My understanding, for example, is there is some inability of one state utility or one state entity to give money to another state entity. So there are some logistics that would need to be worked out if we just kept the current approach that the CEC has had to PEER. But I also believe that there are a lot of questions about what should actually be funded, and there may be some changes desired under what's been done under PEER. But PEER is separate as an R&D activity from the energy efficiency funding, so it would not be part of the bridge. It's on its own separate track.
Okay, great. Thanks for that clarification. We have another question that came in for Mary. Mary, do you have the accounting mechanisms of the fund outline that you can share with listeners on how and when the savings dollars actually get transferred into the fund?
Yes, that information is actually available through SEEC, the State Energy Efficiency Coordinating Collaborative. They had done a series of best practices and fact sheets, and the San Jose's Energy Fund was highlighted on that. We developed that series of standard operating procedures, and that can be accessed through that fact sheet. I've heard some possible problems in accessing that, so I'll make sure that you have the latest web link for that. But if you're going to give your website at the end of this webinar, that's where you can look for the best practices fact sheets.
Great, thanks for that, Mary. I'm just looking to see if there are any additional questions for any of our presenters. We have a question here for Frank that says, I'm surprised that revenues from cap and trade would not more entirely focus on funding infrastructure for renewable energy. Please comment.
That question was for Frank regarding the cap and trade, or maybe I didn't understand. Could you restate the question?
Sure. It says, I'm surprised that revenues from cap and trade would not more entirely focus on funding infrastructure for renewable energy. And then there's it looks like there might be, it says, but more specifically, does the transfer require a budget adjustment or appropriation during the annual budget cycle, et cetera?
Okay, well, certainly a good question. I don't actually know the answer to that.
Andy?
Yeah, I can take it. Yeah, can you? Yeah, I can take a stab at that.
Thanks, Andy.
So yeah, in terms of the question of whether or not the revenues from the cap and trade program could be used for that purpose, it's certainly an item that's on the table. It's been raised by a number of parties. I think one of the key questions that that we have is, to the degree that the state already has a number of renewable energy mandates, there's a question about whether or not you need to use the revenues from cap and trade to support those infrastructure investments, or whether what the price that projects bid into, for example, the renewables portfolio standard, should be able to cover their costs. But the use of those revenues for purposes of supporting renewable energy investments and energy efficiency is something that is being considered.
Okay, great. And looks like we have another question for you, Andy. Do you see any of the funds through cap and trade going directly to local governments rather than just to utilities?
Well, again, I can't prejudge the outcome of the proceeding, but we do have a number of stakeholders who are advocating for some revenues to go directly to local governments to support capacity building. It's certainly not a foregone conclusion that the revenues would go back directly to, actually let me clarify. The money is going back to the utilities, but it's not going to utility shareholders. It's being held in trust by the utilities, and then will be sort of used per the outcome of the CPUC's decision to support activities that benefit ratepayers. And as I mentioned in my presentation, we're kind of going through the exercise now of figuring out what uses would be consistent with the notion of for the benefit of ratepayers. And it could be direct rebates to households. It could be through applied to offset the costs of cap and trade in actual electricity rates, or it could be used to provide additional support for infrastructure investments. So again, all things are on the table, and again, not a foregone conclusion that the money is going to be going back directly to the utilities or go to offset rate increases.
Okay, thanks for that. And Jenny just let me know that if you look in your chat feature, she just posted the link to the San Jose Energy Fund so everyone can have that link. Were there any other questions for any of our speakers? And as Jenny mentioned, you can certainly pass along your questions and we will get them answered after this webinar.
Okay, well, I guess that concludes our webinar. All of our presenters' emails are on the screen, and feel free to download their presentations or contact them with any further questions that you have. All the presentations are already uploaded on the website, which is www.lgc.org/seek. And I wanted to thank all of the speakers again who took time to speak on this webinar today, and I wanted to thank all of you who tuned in today to learn more about energy program funding for local governments. We hope that you found it incredibly useful. And please take a few minutes to fill out the survey. As I mentioned, it really helps us choose future topics and improve our future webinars. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for joining us.